My pregnant daughter-in-law called me a maid in front of 200 wedding guests. Her whole family laughed at my clothes. I let them finish humiliating me, then quietly grabbed the microphone and made an announcement with a DNA test that revealed, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I should have known something was wrong the moment I walked into the venue. The way Elod's mother Patricia looked me up and down with those cold blue eyes, her lips pursing like she'd tasted something sour. But I was so excited about my son's wedding, so proud to finally meet Brent's new family, that I missed all the warning signs. I had spent weeks preparing for this day. I'd saved up $300 from my part-time job at the grocery store to buy a navy blue dress from Macy's. It wasn't designer, but it was new, and I thought I looked nice. I'd even gotten my hair done at the local salon, splurging $45 I couldn't really afford because I wanted everything to be perfect for Brent's special day. The Riverside Country Club was more elegant than anywhere I'd ever been. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and white roses decorated every table. 200 guests filled the reception hall, all dressed in expensive clothes that probably cost more than I made in a month. I felt small walking through those doors, but I held my head high. This was my son's wedding, and I had every right to be there. Brent looked so handsome in his black tuxedo, standing next to Elodie in her flowing white gown. At 28, he'd grown into such a successful man working as a marketing manager for a tech company. I was so proud of him, even though lately it felt like we were strangers. Ever since he'd started dating Elodie 2 years ago, our weekly phone calls had become monthly, then occasional. But I told myself that was normal. Young men were supposed to focus on their wives, not their mothers. The ceremony was beautiful. I sat in the third row, not the front where the mother of the groom typically sits. But Elodie had explained that was reserved for her grandparents. I didn't mind. I was just happy to be there watching my son promise to love and cherish this woman who was already 6 months pregnant with my first grandchild. After the ceremony, guests mingled during cocktail hour. I stood near the bar nursing a glass of white wine and trying to make conversation with strangers who seemed to look through me like I was invisible. That's when I overheard Patricia talking to her sister about the inappropriate guest list. "I can't believe they invited the help," Patricia said, her voice carrying just loud enough for me to hear. "Look at that woman by the bar in the cheap dress. She looks like she should be serving drinks, not drinking them." My cheeks burned with embarrassment, but I told myself she couldn't be talking about me. I was Brent's mother. Surely no one would mistake me for hired help. Then dinner was announced, and I looked for my table assignment. The elegant seating chart was displayed on a golden easel near the entrance with names written in beautiful calligraphy. I scanned the list twice before finding my name at table 18, tucked away in the back corner, far from the head table where Brent and Elodie sat. The table was filled with what appeared to be Elod's distant relatives and a few of Brent's old college friends I'd never met. They were polite but distant, making small talk about people and places I didn't know. I smiled and nodded, feeling more isolated with each passing minute. Then came the moment that shattered everything. During the reception, as guests were finishing their main course, Elodie stood up to make a speech. She looked radiant, her hand resting on her rounded belly as she spoke about love and family and new beginnings. The room was quiet, everyone hanging on her every word. "I want to thank everyone who made this day so special," she said, her voice sweet and clear. "My parents who gave me everything, Brent's colleagues who've become such good friends, and of course all the wonderful people who helped make today perfect." She paused, and her eyes found mine across the crowded room. Something cold flickered in her gaze. "I especially want to thank the service staff who worked so hard today. The caterers, the florists, and even she gestured toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The woman in the blue dress who I assume is here to help clean up later. Thank you all for your service." The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Then Patricia started laughing, a sharp, delighted sound that cut through the quiet like a knife. Soon other members of Elodie's family joined in their laughter, growing louder and more cruel. "Oh, Elodie, Patricia gasped between laughs. "You're terrible. That poor woman probably spent her whole paycheck on that dress just to feel fancy for one night." I felt my face burn with humiliation. 200 pairs of eyes seemed to be staring at me, some with amusement, others with pity. The wine glass in my hand trembled, and I had to set it down before I dropped it. Brent looked confused, glancing between his new wife and me. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but Elodie quickly moved on with her speech, thanking the real wedding planner and moving the attention away from the moment. But the damage was done. I'd been publicly humiliated, mistaken for hired help at my own son's wedding. The woman carrying my grandchild had just called me a servant in front of everyone I was supposed to call family. Now I wanted to run. Every instinct told me to grab my purse and escape to my car to drive home and pretend this nightmare had never happened. But something kept me frozen in my chair. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the shock of such cruelty from someone I barely knew. As Elodie finished her speech and the evening continued around me, I sat in that back corner table, invisible and forgotten. The laughter had died down, but I could still feel the stares, the whispered comments about the poor woman who'd been so publicly embarrassed. What hurt most wasn't even the humiliation itself. It was the realization that my son hadn't defended me. He'd sat there and watched his mother be mocked, and he'd done nothing. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, had chosen his new wife's cruelty over his mother's dignity. But as I sat there in the shadows, something began to stir inside me. A memory from long ago. A secret I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it wasn't real. 29 years of protecting that secret, of keeping a truth that could change everything. Maybe it was time for everyone to learn just exactly who they'd been laughing at. The drive home from the wedding was a blur of tears and rage. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I replayed Elodie's words over and over. The woman in the blue dress who I assume is here to help clean up later. The laughter that followed the way my own son had said nothing, absolutely nothing, to defend me. By the time I reached my small apartment, the humiliation had settled into something deeper, a familiar ache that reminded me of all the times I'd been overlooked, dismissed, treated like I didn't matter. But this time felt different. This time they'd gone too far. I sat on my couch, still wearing that navy blue dress, the one I'd been so proud of just hours earlier. Now it felt like evidence of my inadequacy, proof that I didn't belong in their world of country clubs and crystal chandeliers. I wanted to tear it off, but I couldn't seem to move. Instead, I found myself thinking about Brent as a little boy. How he used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, his small body curled against mine, while I whispered that everything would be okay. How he'd wait by the window every evening for me to come home from my second job, pressing his face against the glass until he saw my car pull up. Those were the hardest years. After his father walked out when Brent was just 6 months old, leaving me with nothing but a note saying he wasn't ready to be a father. I was 19 years old, alone and terrified. I had no family to turn to, no college degree, no real skills, except the determination to give my baby a better life than I'd had. I worked 3 jobs for years. Mornings at the diner, afternoons, cleaning offices, nights stocking shelves at the supermarket. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor, watched Brent for whatever I could afford to pay her, which some weeks was nothing but groceries or help with her yard work. There were nights I fell asleep standing up in the stockroom, my body so exhausted I could barely function. Mornings when I had to choose between buying Brent new shoes or paying the electric bill. Christmases when his presents came from the clearance rack at the dollar store wrapped in newspaper because I couldn't afford proper wrapping paper. But I never let him see me cry. Never let him know how scared I was, that I wasn't enough, that I couldn't give him what other kids had. I wanted him to believe his mother was strong, capable, someone he could be proud of. When Brent started kindergarten, the other mothers would cluster together at pickup time, talking about their husbands' jobs and their weekend plans. I'd hurry in wearing my work uniform, grab Brent, and leave before anyone could ask questions about why I always looked so tired, why my car was 15 years old, why I never volunteered for class parties. The parent-teacher conferences were the worst, sitting in those tiny plastic chairs, while Mrs. Rodriguez explained that Brent was bright, but sometimes seemed distracted that he'd fallen asleep during story time twice that week. I knew it was because he'd been up late the night before, wanting to wait for me to come home from my evening shift so I could read to him. "He talks about you constantly," Mrs. Rodriguez had said gently. "You're his whole world, Miss Cooper. But maybe he needs more structure, more routine." I'd nodded and smiled, promising to work on it, while inside I was dying. How could I give him more routine when I was working 60 hours a week just to keep us afloat? How could I be the mother he deserved when I was barely surviving myself? High school was better financially, at least. I'd finally landed a steady job as a secretary at an insurance office, and we'd moved to a nicer apartment, but by then Brent was pulling away. He was embarrassed by our old car, by the fact that his friends' mothers didn't work, by the way I had to budget every dollar we spent. When he got accepted to college with a partial scholarship, I was so proud I cried for hours. But the partial scholarship meant I still needed to come up with $8,000 a year for his expenses. I took out loans, I'm still paying off, picked up weekend work, ate nothing but peanut butter sandwiches for months so he could have the college experience he deserved. He called less and less as the years went by. Started talking about his professors and his new friends with an enthusiasm he'd never shown for anything back home. During his junior year, he stopped coming home for spring break, choosing instead to go to Florida with his roommates. During his senior year, he brought a girlfriend home for Christmas, a sweet girl named Jennifer, who seemed genuinely interested in hearing my stories about Brent's childhood. But Jennifer didn't last. None of them did, until Elodie. I'll never forget the first time Brent brought her to dinner. She was beautiful, sophisticated, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She smiled politely when Brent introduced us, but I could see her taking inventory of my small apartment, my secondhand furniture, my obvious attempts to make everything look nicer than it was. "So you work at an insurance office," she'd said during dinner, her tone carefully neutral. "That must be interesting." I'd started to explain what I did, but Brent quickly changed the subject to his job, his promotion, his future plans that seemed to exist in a world where I was an afterthought. That night after they left, I'd stood in my kitchen washing dishes and trying to understand why I felt so small. Elodie hadn't been rude exactly. She'd said all the right things, complimented my cooking, thanked me for dinner. But there was something in her eyes, a judgment I recognized from all those years of being looked down on. As their relationship grew more serious, Brent's visits became even less frequent. When he did call, the conversations felt stilted, like he was checking a box on his to-do list. When they announced their engagement, he told me over the phone. And when I asked about wedding plans, he said they were keeping it small and simple. 200 guests didn't seem small to me, but I didn't say anything. I was just grateful to be included. Now sitting in my apartment still wearing that blue dress, I realized I'd been fooling myself. I wasn't family to Elodie and her people. I was an embarrassment, a reminder of the humble beginnings Brent was trying to leave behind. But what they didn't know, what Brent himself didn't know, was that our beginnings weren't as humble as they thought. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the old shoebox I kept in the back of my closet. Inside were documents I'd hidden for almost 30 years, papers that told a story I'd never shared with anyone. My hands trembled as I lifted out the hospital records, the private investigator's report, and most importantly, the DNA test results I'd paid for just last month. The test results that proved everything I'd suspected, but never dared to confirm. Brent's father hadn't been the deadbeat who'd abandoned us. His real father was someone else entirely, someone who had no idea he had a son, someone whose name carried weight in this city, whose family had money and influence and everything Elodie thought she was marrying into. Tomorrow I would make a phone call I should have made 29 years ago. The morning after the wedding, I woke up with my makeup smeared across my pillowcase and my head pounding from crying myself to sleep. But for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Purpose. The humiliation was still there, burning in my chest like a coal, but underneath it was something stronger, the truth. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat at my small kitchen table with the documents spread out before me. 29 years of secrets, of protecting a lie that had shaped both our lives. It was time to face what I'd been too scared, too ashamed to confront all those years ago. The story began when I was 18, working as a waitress at Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. I was young, naive, and completely out of my depth, serving wealthy businessmen and society wives who treated me like I was invisible. But the tips were good, and I needed every dollar I could get to help my sick mother with her medical bills. Marcus Wellington was a regular customer, 35 years old, devastatingly handsome, and married to one of the most prominent women in the city. He came in every Tuesday for lunch, always sitting at table 12, always ordering the same thing, grilled salmon with a side salad and a glass of white wine. At first, our interactions were purely professional. He was polite, but distant the way wealthy men often were with working-class girls like me. But after a few weeks, he started asking about my day, commenting on books I was reading during my breaks, leaving generous tips that helped me catch up on my mother's mounting hospital bills. I should have known better. I should have recognized the pattern for what it was. But I was 18 and flattered by the attention of this sophisticated, successful man who seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. When he asked me to have coffee with him after my shift one evening, I said yes. The affair lasted 3 months. 3 months of stolen afternoons in hotel rooms, of expensive dinners in restaurants across town where no one would recognize him, of promises he made that I was foolish enough to believe. He told me his marriage was loveless, that he and Victoria were staying together only for appearances. He said he'd never felt the way he felt about me, that somehow we'd find a way to be together. I fell completely, desperately in love. For those 3 months, I felt like I was living in a fairy tale. This powerful, wealthy man had chosen me, loved me, wanted to build a future with me. I started dreaming about the life we'd have together, the family we'd create. Then I missed my period. When I told Marcus I was pregnant, everything changed. The warmth disappeared from his eyes, replaced by something cold and calculating. He paced around that hotel room like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair and muttering about complications and scandals. "This can't happen," he said finally, his voice flat and emotionless. "Victoria and I are trying to have a baby. If this comes out now, it will destroy everything." He offered to pay for an abortion. When I refused, he offered money to disappear, to move to another state and never contact him again. When I told him I couldn't do that either, that this baby was ours and deserved to have a father, he became someone I didn't recognize. "You knew what this was," he said, his voice cruel in a way I'd never heard before. "You knew I was married. If you think you can trap me with this pregnancy, you're more naive than I thought." That was the last time I saw him. He stopped coming to the restaurant, stopped taking my calls, stopped existing in my world as completely as if he'd never been there at all. Within a week, I was fired from Romanos. The manager claimed it was because of customer complaints about my attitude, but I knew the truth. Marcus had made sure I couldn't stay. I spent the rest of my pregnancy working whatever jobs I could find, trying to save money for the baby, while dealing with morning sickness that lasted all day and the crushing loneliness of facing it all alone. When Brent was born, I stared into his tiny face and saw Marcus's green eyes, his strong chin, his thick dark hair. But I also made a decision that night in the hospital. This baby would never know the pain of being rejected by his father. I would create a different story, one where his father was someone who'd loved us but couldn't stay. It was a lie, but it was a kinder lie than the truth. For years, I convinced myself I'd done the right thing. I watched Marcus from afar as he built his real estate empire, as he and Victoria finally had their own children, as he became one of the most respected businessmen in the city. I told myself that Brent was better off without knowing that his father was a man who'd tried to buy his way out of responsibility. But lately, especially since Brent had become engaged to Elodie, doubts had started creeping in. I watched my son work so hard to fit into a world where he felt like an outsider, where his humble background made him feel inferior. I watched him distance himself from me because he was ashamed of where he came from. 3 months ago, I'd finally gathered the courage to do what I should have done years earlier. I hired a private investigator to confirm what I'd always known in my heart. Then I collected DNA samples from a water glass Brent had used during one of his rare visits, and from a coffee cup Marcus had discarded after a charity event I'd attended specifically to get close to him. The results came back 2 weeks before the wedding. 99.9% probability that Marcus Wellington was Brent's biological father. I'd stared at those papers for hours trying to decide what to do with the information. Part of me wanted to let sleeping dogs lie, to let Brent continue believing the story I'd created. But another part of me, the part that had grown stronger over the years of watching my son struggle with feelings of inadequacy, knew he deserved the truth. He deserved to know that he came from money and power, that his instincts for business and his natural confidence weren't accidents, but inheritance. He deserved to know that his mother hadn't been abandoned by some deadbeat, but had been discarded by a powerful man who was too cowardly to take responsibility for his actions. Most importantly, after last night's humiliation, he deserved to know that the people laughing at his mother had just mocked the woman who'd raised the heir to one of the city's most prominent fortunes. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number the private investigator had given me. Marcus Wellington's direct office line. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment. Once I made this call, there would be no going back. Everything would change for all of us. But as I remembered the sound of Patricia's laughter, the way Elodie had dismissed me as hired help, the way my own son had sat silently while his mother was humiliated, I realized that maybe everything needed to change. Maybe it was time for the Wellington family to meet their newest member. The phone rang 3 times before a crisp, professional voice answered. Wellington Development Corporation, Marcus Wellington's office. "I need to speak with Mr. Wellington," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "It's regarding a personal matter from 29 years ago." There was a pause. "Mr. Wellington is in meetings all morning. May I ask what this is regarding?" I took a deep breath. "Tell him Darla Cooper is calling from Romano's restaurant. He'll know what it's about." Another pause. Longer this time. "Please hold." The wait felt eternal. I walked around my small apartment, the phone pressed to my ear, wondering if he would even take the call. Part of me hoped he wouldn't. Part of me hoped I could hang up and pretend this conversation had never happened. Then his voice came through the line, older but unmistakably the same. Darla. Just my name spoken like a ghost from his past that he'd hoped would never resurface. "Hello, Marcus." Silence stretched between us, filled with 29 years of secrets and lies, and a son who didn't know his father's name. "What do you want?" His voice was careful, controlled, but I could hear the tension underneath. "I want to meet. There's something you need to know." "Darla, if this is about money, it's about your son." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him processing the implications of those 4 words. "I don't have a son," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "His name is Brent Cooper. He's 28 years old, 6 tall, has your green eyes and your stubborn chin. He just got married yesterday." I paused, letting that sink in. To a woman who's 6 months pregnant with your grandchild, another long silence. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You told me you took care of it. I told you I would handle it. I never said how." I heard him exhale sharply. "What do you want? Darla money a payoff to disappear again?" The question stung, but I kept my voice level. "I want you to meet your son. He deserves to know who his father is. That's impossible. Victoria doesn't know about what happened between us. My children don't know my reputation." "Your reputation." The words came out sharper than I intended. "Marcus, I raised your son alone. I worked 3 jobs to put him through college. I never asked you for a dime, never tried to contact you, never caused you any trouble. But things have changed. What do you mean? I mean your son married into a family that thinks I'm hired help. Last night at his wedding, his new wife called me a servant in front of 200 people. They laughed at me, Marcus. They laughed at the mother of your child because they think we're nobody." I could hear him moving around, probably pacing his office the way he used to pace that hotel room when I told him I was pregnant. "I have DNA results," I continued. 99.9% probability. Your son has a right to know where he comes from. And after what happened last night, I think it's time he found out. Darla, please think about what you're doing. This will destroy everything I've built. You should have thought about that 29 years ago. The line went quiet for so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, he spoke again. "What exactly are you proposing? I want you to meet Brent. I want you to see what a good man he became despite growing up without a father. And then I want you to decide if you're going to do the right thing this time. And if I refuse, I looked at the DNA results spread across my kitchen table, at the photos of Brent I'd been saving to show his father someday at the wedding invitation that had started this whole chain of events. Then I'll tell him myself along with everyone else who needs to know. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, I could hear the resignation in his voice. "Where do you want to meet? Riverside Park, the pavilion by the lake. Tomorrow at 2:00. How will I know him? Bring a photo of yourself at 28. He looks exactly like you did then." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time staring at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. For the first time since I'd walked into that country club yesterday, I felt calm, purposeful. I wasn't doing this for revenge, though. I'd be lying if I said the thought of Patricia's face when she learned the truth didn't bring me some satisfaction. I was doing this because Brent deserved better. He deserved to know he came from success, from intelligence, from a lineage that included business acumen and natural leadership. More than that, he deserved to know that his mother hadn't been abandoned by some worthless man. She'd been discarded by a powerful one who was too selfish to claim his own child. I spent the rest of the day planning exactly what I would say to Brent. How do you tell your son that everything he thinks he knows about his father is a lie? How do you explain that you've been protecting a secret that could have changed his entire life? That evening I called Brent. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. "Hi, Mom. Listen, I can't talk long. Elod's not feeling well and we're trying to get settled after yesterday. I just wanted to thank you for including me in the wedding," I said carefully. "It was beautiful." There was a pause. "Yeah, about that. Mom, I'm sorry if some of Elod's family seemed a little standoffish. They're very traditional, very formal. It's nothing personal." Nothing personal, as if publicly humiliating his mother was just a matter of etiquette. "I understand," I said, "but I was hoping we could have lunch tomorrow, just the two of us. There's something important I need to discuss with you. Tomorrow's not good. We have appointments to look at bigger apartments. Maybe next week, Brent. This can't wait until next week. It's about your father." The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and heavy. Brent and I never talked about his father. It was an unspoken rule, a topic that had been off limits for so long it had become second nature to avoid it. "What about him?" His voice was carefully neutral. "I need to tell you some things. I probably should have told you years ago." "Please, son, it's important." Another pause. "Fine, lunch tomorrow, but I can only spare an hour." "How's all?" After I hung up, I pulled out the DNA results one more time. Tomorrow, everything would change. By this time tomorrow, Brent would know he was a Wellington. He'd know that the people who'd laughed at his mother had just mocked someone whose family name was on buildings throughout the city. He'd also know that his mother had spent 29 years protecting him from a truth that might have made his life easier, but would have come with a cost he was too young to understand. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the envelope. Tomorrow, I would give my son the gift of knowing who he really was, and maybe for the first time in his life, he'd understand why his mother had fought so hard to give him everything she could. The lunch with Brent didn't go as planned. We met at a small cafe downtown, the same place where I used to take him for his birthday meals when money was tight. He arrived 15 minutes late, checking his phone constantly, and making it clear he wanted this conversation to be over quickly. When I started to explain about his father, about Marcus Wellington, about the DNA test, he went completely silent. Not the shocked silence I'd expected, but something colder, more distant. "Let me get this straight," he said finally, his voice flat. "You're telling me that my father is Marcus Wellington, the Marcus Wellington who owns half the commercial real estate in this city. And you've known this my entire life, Brent. You have to understand. No, Mom. You have to understand." He leaned forward, his green eyes, Marcus's eyes blazing with anger. "Do you have any idea what my life could have been like? Do you know how many times I felt like an outsider? Like I didn't belong anywhere because I thought I came from nothing?" I tried to explain about protecting him, about not wanting him to know his father had rejected us, but he wasn't listening. He was too angry, too hurt by 28 years of what he saw as lies. "I can't deal with this right now," he said, standing up abruptly. "Elod's pregnant. We're trying to start our life together, and now you dropped this bomb on me. Why now, Mom? Why after all these years?" I wanted to tell him about the wedding, about the humiliation, about how his wife's family had treated me. But looking at his face, I realized he wouldn't see it the way I did. He'd see it as his mother causing problems, making waves in his new life. He left without finishing his coffee, without hearing the rest of the story, without understanding that I'd contacted Marcus and arranged for them to meet. I sat in that cafe for another hour, staring at the DNA results I'd brought to show him, wondering if I'd just destroyed our relationship forever. That evening, Marcus called me back. "I met with him," he said without preamble, "at the park like you suggested, and he's angry with you for keeping this secret. He feels betrayed." There was a pause, but he looks exactly like I did at his age. There's no denying he's my son. I closed my eyes, relief and sadness washing over me in equal measure. What happens now? I've invited him to dinner tomorrow night. He wants to meet Victoria and his half-siblings. He wants to understand his heritage. Marcus's voice was careful, measured. "Darla, I owe you an apology. 29 years overdue, but you deserved better than what I gave you. It's not about me anymore, Marcus. It's about Brent and your grandchild. I know, and I intend to make sure they both know they're part of this family." After we hung up, I felt a mixture of relief and loss. I'd done what I set out to do, given Brent his birthright, his true identity, but in doing so, I might have lost my son forever. The next few days passed in a blur. Brent didn't call, didn't answer my messages. I heard through the grapevine Mrs. Henderson still kept up with all the neighborhood gossip that he'd been seen having dinner at the Wellington mansion, that he'd been spotted at the country club with Marcus. Then 5 days after our disastrous lunch, my phone rang. It was Elodie. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Can you come over tonight 8:00? I almost said no. After the wedding humiliation, the last thing I wanted was to face her again. But something in her tone made me agree. Their apartment was in an upscale complex across town, the kind of place I could never have afforded even when I was working. 3 jobs. Elodie answered the door wearing an expensive maternity dress, her face pale and drawn. "Come in," she said stiffly. "Brent's not here. He's having dinner with his father again." The way she said father made it clear she was still processing this new reality. We sat in their pristine living room, expensive furniture and wedding gifts arranged perfectly around us. "I owe you an apology," she said, finally the words clearly difficult for her to say. "At the wedding, what I said, I didn't know who you were. You knew exactly who I was. I'm Brent's mother." She flinched. "I know, and I'm sorry. My family were very focused on appearances, on social status. It's not an excuse, but it's the truth." I studied her face, looking for sincerity behind the perfectly applied makeup. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because everything's changed." She placed a protective hand over her rounded belly. "Brent is a Wellington. That baby I'm carrying is a Wellington heir. And you?" She took a shaky breath. "You're the mother of one of the most prominent men in the city." There it was. Not genuine remorse, but fear. Fear that she'd offended someone who could now affect her social standing. "Elodie," I said gently, "I didn't reveal Brent's parentage to get back at you or your family. I did it because my son deserved to know the truth about who he is. But you must hate us. After what we did, I looked at this young woman 6 months pregnant and clearly terrified that she'd ruined her chances at the life she'd always wanted. Despite everything, I felt sorry for her. I don't hate you," I said, "but I won't pretend what happened didn't hurt. You publicly humiliated me at your own wedding in front of people who are supposed to be family now." Tears started flowing down her cheeks. I know. And I'm so sorry. My mother, she influenced me, made me think that anyone who wasn't like us didn't matter. But now Brent barely speaks to me. He's so angry about how we treated you. This was news to me. Brent hadn't said a word about defending me when we'd had lunch. "He's been staying at his father's house," she continued. "He says he needs time to process everything, but I think he's ashamed of me, of how I acted." I felt a small flicker of satisfaction followed immediately by guilt. This young woman was carrying my grandchild. Whatever else she'd done, she and I were connected now through that baby. "What do you want from me, Elodie? I want you to forgive me. I want my husband back, and I want—" She hesitated, then rushed on. "I want to know if you'll help me make this right." I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? There's a Wellington family gathering next weekend, a charity fundraiser they host every year. Marcus has invited Brent, and Brent wants to bring you as his mother as a Wellington family member. My heart skipped a beat. A Wellington family gathering. 6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined such a thing. 6 days ago, I was being laughed at as hired help. I want to make a public apology, Elodie continued. At the fundraiser in front of everyone who matters in the city, I want to acknowledge what I did wrong and make sure everyone knows how much I respect you. I stared at her, trying to process what she was suggesting. A public apology would be satisfying. Certainly, but it would also be empty if it wasn't sincere. Why, I asked, why do you really want to do this? She was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded over her belly. When she spoke, her voice was small and honest in a way I hadn't heard before. Because I'm going to be a mother soon, and I want my child to grow up in a family where love matters more than money, where people are valued for who they are, not what they have. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. I want to be better than my mother was better than I've been. For the first time since I'd met her, Elodie seemed genuine. Not the polished society girl putting on an act, but a scared young woman trying to figure out how to be worthy of the family she'd married into. Okay, I said finally, but not a public apology. That would be for show for other people. If you want to make this right, you do it privately. You rebuild trust through actions, not grand gestures. She nodded eagerly. Yes, whatever you think is best. And Elodie, I want you to understand something. I may be a Wellington now by connection, but I'm still the same woman you laughed at a week ago. The woman who worked 3 jobs to raise her son, who couldn't afford designer dresses or country club memberships. If you can't respect that woman, then nothing has really changed. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I understand, and for what it's worth, I think that woman is stronger than anyone I know. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As I drove home that night, I thought about the strange turns my life had taken in just 1 week. From being humiliated as hired help to being acknowledged as the mother of a Wellington heir, from watching my son pull away from me to having his wife beg for my forgiveness. But the most important change wasn't about status or money or social standing. It was about truth. For the first time in 29 years, my son knew who he really was, and maybe eventually he'd understand why his mother had kept that truth hidden for so long. 6 months later, I stood in the nursery of Brent and Elo's new house, a wedding gift from Marcus, holding my grandson for the first time. Little Marcus James Cooper Wellington was perfect with his father's dark hair and his grandfather's green eyes. As I looked down at his sleeping face, I felt a peace I hadn't known was possible. The path to this moment hadn't been easy. It took weeks for Brent to forgive me for keeping the secret of his parentage. There were long, difficult conversations where he expressed his anger at being denied a relationship with his father, his hurt at feeling like I hadn't trusted him with the truth. But there were also moments of understanding, like when Marcus told him about the man who'd abandoned us, the story I'd created to protect him from knowing his father had actually rejected him. Or when Victoria Wellington, with tears in her eyes, apologized for the years Brent had spent feeling like an outsider when he was actually their flesh and blood. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been, Victoria had said to me during one of our first meetings. Raising him alone, protecting him from such painful truths. You gave him something we never could have: unconditional love without expectation. The Wellington family embraced Brent completely. Marcus made him a partner in Wellington Development Corporation, bringing him into the family business with an enthusiasm that spoke of years of regret. Brent's half-siblings, Marcus Jr. and Catherine, welcomed him warmly, curious about the brother they'd never known existed. But the biggest change was in my relationship with Elodie. True to her word, she didn't make grand public gestures or dramatic apologies. Instead, she began showing up at my apartment with groceries when she knew money was tight. She asked about my childhood, my struggles as a young mother, my dreams I'd put aside to raise Brent. Slowly, carefully, she built a bridge between us. I want our baby to know his grandmother, she'd said during one of these visits, her hand resting on her expanding belly. Not just know you, but really know you. Your stories, your strength, your love. The biggest surprise came 3 months before the baby was born. Brent and Elodie showed up at my apartment with an envelope that changed everything. "What's this?" I asked, looking at the official-looking documents inside. "Deed to the house on Maple Street," Brent said, his voice thick with emotion. "The one you always drove past when I was little. Remember, you used to say it was your dream house." I stared at the papers, unable to process what I was seeing. The house on Maple Street was a beautiful Victorian with a wraparound porch and a garden where I'd imagined growing flowers. I'd driven past it countless times over the years, always just to look, never imagining I could afford such a place. "I can't accept this," I whispered. "Yes, you can," Elodie said firmly. "You spent 29 years sacrificing everything for your family. Let your family take care of you now." "Besides," Brent added with a smile that reminded me of the little boy he used to be, "the baby's going to need somewhere to visit his grandmother, somewhere with a big backyard for playing and a kitchen where she can teach him to bake cookies." I cried then, great heaving sobs that came from 29 years of worry and struggle and putting everyone else's needs before my own. But they weren't sad tears. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of finally understanding that the sacrifices I'd made had been worth everything. Now, holding little Marcus in my arms, I thought about how much had changed since that terrible night at the wedding. Elodie had grown into a thoughtful young mother who asked for my advice and genuinely seemed to value my opinions. She'd also distanced herself from her own mother, setting boundaries about the kind of behavior she would and wouldn't tolerate around her new family. "I don't want our son growing up thinking people's worth is measured by their bank account," she told me just last week. "I want him to understand that strength and character matter more than social status." Brent had found his place in the Wellington family while maintaining his close relationship with me. He called every day, stopped by the new house several times a week, and had even framed a photo of us from his high school graduation to keep on his office desk at Wellington Development. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand," he'd said just a month ago, sitting on my new front porch swing. "You weren't keeping secrets to hurt me. You were protecting me the only way you knew how." Marcus, too, had surprised me. What started as obligation, acknowledging his son and taking responsibility for his grandchild, had evolved into something deeper. He'd asked me to lunch several times, not to discuss Brent or the baby, but just to talk, to finally have the conversations we'd never been able to have 29 years ago. I was a coward, he'd admitted during one of these lunches. I was so focused on protecting my reputation, my marriage, my position in society, that I never thought about what I was doing to you or to him. "We turned out fine," I'd replied, and I meant it. "You turned out better than fine. You raised an incredible man under impossible circumstances. I've spent my whole life building a business empire, but what you built, Brent's character, his values, his capacity for love, that's worth more than all the money in the world." As I rocked little Marcus in my arms, I heard voices downstairs. Brent and Marcus had arrived for their weekly dinner, a tradition that had started when the baby was born. Soon Victoria would arrive with her famous apple pie, and Catherine and Marcus Jr. would show up with their own children for cousin playtime. The house that had once seemed impossibly grand was now filled with the sound of family. Real family built not just on blood, but on love, forgiveness, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the hardest struggles. Elodie appeared in the doorway, smiling as she watched me with the baby. "He loves his grandmother," she said softly. "He always stops crying the moment you pick him up. He knows love when he feels it," I replied, kissing the baby's soft forehead. "Darla," Elodie said, her voice serious now, "I need you to know something. That night at the wedding, when I called you hired help, it's the thing I'm most ashamed of in my entire life. Not because of who you turned out to be connected to, but because of who you've always been. You're the strongest woman I know." I looked at my daughter-in-law, because that's what she'd become truly and completely, and smiled. "We've all made mistakes, sweetheart. What matters is what we do moving forward." Little Marcus stirred in my arms, opening those bright green eyes that connected him to a legacy he'd grow up knowing and understanding. He'd never wonder about his heritage, never feel like an outsider, never question whether he was loved unconditionally. But more than that, he'd grow up knowing the story of his grandmother, who worked 3 jobs to raise his father alone. He'd understand that wealth and status are gifts to be grateful for, not entitlements to lord over others. He'd learned that the strongest people are often those who faced the hardest struggles. As the voices downstairs grew louder with laughter and conversation, I carried little Marcus down to join his family. The family that had been fractured and hidden for 29 years was now whole stronger for having been tested. I thought about that night at the wedding, about the humiliation that had finally pushed me to reveal the truth I'd kept hidden for so long. At the time, it had felt like the worst moment of my life. Now I understood it had been the catalyst for the best thing that ever happened to all of us. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most painful packages. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find, everything you actually needed. And sometimes the people who hurt you the most end up becoming the family you'd always dreamed of having. As I settled into my chair at the dinner table, surrounded by laughter and love, and the baby who carried all our hopes for the future, I realized I wouldn't change a single thing about my journey. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt had led me here to this moment, to this family, to this beautiful, imperfect, absolutely perfect life. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.